Hi, everybody. This is Ali with the Lead with Meaning podcast. I am so excited to have this conversation today with my guest, Rebecca Roberts. Rebecca is a coach, a speaker, and a storyteller. And she's got a great coin term that I fell in love with when I started to meet her online with her contact called the inner architect. Rebecca, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, Ali, it's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me. And thanks
Yeah.
for being open to talking about all this stuff. I love it.
Yeah, and I've shared this before, but one of my motivations to have these conversations when I really started this, because generally I'm a pretty private person, and just over the last year, I've started to put my face out there, was that I felt that there was a real gap in kind of the professional business space on consciousness and awareness. And I think it's so relevant, especially in this pandemic world that we're living in today, that people are looking inward. And a lot of your content just spoke to me, and I really wanted to share it with my audience and other people in the community. So thank you for being with us today.
Super nice.
There's one story I wanted to share that I thought would kind of segue into kind of the work that you're doing. And it's the story that I heard about, and if my guest could just kind of imagine you're in your home and you have your keys in your hand and the power goes out and the lights go out, and you're sitting there stumbling around looking for your keys, and you realize you're not going to find what you're looking for in the dark. And you look outside and there's a street light on, and you decide, you know what, I'm not going to stumble around in the dark here. I'm going to go outside looking for my keys. And you're out there in the street, and your neighbor comes by and says, what's going on? And he says, I lost my keys. And you're both stuck, out there, in the street light looking for your keys. And then your neighbor asks, well, where did you lose them? And you say, well, I lost them inside my house. And with a puzzled look, your neighbor says, well, then why are we out here in the street looking for your keys? And we laugh, but how often are we looking outside for a problem that's inside of us? And I can't take credit for this story. My great teacher, Wayne Dyer, had shared this story, but it really resonates with me on how often we're looking outside for answers that are inside. And it reminded me of a story you shared back in 2013 when a friend had a similar, conversation with you that sparked something that really spoke to me. And I thought maybe you could share that story today.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I love it because it really is. There's this moment where every now and then just the right question comes at the right time and it lands, and you recognize the silliness or the interesting dynamic of where you're actually looking for your answers. So yeah, that story resonates hugely with me because I grew up in Louisiana, and Louisiana is an absolutely amazing place, like rich culture and good music and amazing food. And it's also a space that we're known for Southern charm, right? Which is such a beautiful thing. But it's also a little bit, at least my temperament and the culture that I grew up in, it turns into this don't rock the boat kind of culture. This everybody is polite to everybody and, oh honey, how you doing? And it's super, super friendly. But when it comes time for some confrontation or discomfort, that's a little touchy. At least it was for me.
Mm.
And depending on where, everybody has their own Louisiana in this case, right? Everybody has their own culture that they grew up with that provides certain structures and certain ways to be. And I just grew up knowing that there were certain things that were good and certain things that were really not good and that you should definitely not pursue. And it was so clearly laid out that it shaped a very clear path for me. I kind of had this checklist of, yes, this is what you should have for your type of job. You should have good money. You should marry a nice person. You should have children. You should, the checklist. And at some point in time, I had all of those things on the checklist, and I was still recognizing there still feels like there's something missing. And it's interesting whenever I think back to those keys, right? There's something missing. And so we've looked, at least I did, I looked outside for all of that. So I had this this mental image, this blueprint of how everything should be on the outside, and that when that stuff is in order, then I'm all good. But I didn't really own my belief systems. They were all gathered and collected, and I hadn't really questioned much. I was very curious, but I was very curious outward focused.
Mm.
So I would be the one running around the yard, right? Trying to figure out everything about all the bugs and the snakes and the turtles. But I had never really allowed the questions to sink in. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, in 2013, I ended up having a beautiful conversation with a dear friend. And at some point in time, we were talking about religion, and
Not
we had
controversial at all.
not controversial at all. No, no, no. And we had very different views.
Yeah.
And she just lovingly, but very directly asked, why do you believe what you believe? And in that moment, I think it was really the first time that the question really sunk in. Because as I talk about in that little video, my mouth started just spitting out all of the pre-programmed answers. Well, A, B, C, these are the reasons.
The story we tell ourselves, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to be honest, most people, it's amazing to me that people don't think of themselves as creative or storytellers. Every single one of us is incredibly creative, because the stories we come up with about how the world works, you have to be creative to be able to come up with some of these things. And the stories we tell ourselves are incredibly elaborate. And the ones that I had told myself were, some of them, really rich and beautiful. And it's not that they weren't true, or they just weren't tried and tested for me.
What do you mean by that?
I hadn't lived these experiences. For example, some of my religious beliefs at the time, I knew, like something in me knew that there was something behind it, but I had never really allowed myself to question, because there were certain things that, no, God's big, just trust. Well, now I believe God's big. He's big enough to handle any questions that little old me can come up with. Like, in the curious spirit, we look at children, they're so curious. And that's such a beautiful inbuilt exploration tool that over time we tend to override it with logic and with knowledge. But then the wisdom truly comes from integrating that childlike wonder and curiosity with the wisdom and knowledge and understanding that we gain as we grow up.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And there's a reason why, Einstein, who we recognize as one of the most brilliant people of all time, says imagination is one of the most powerful things we can't lose sight of. And I often share with people in my life, especially younger generations, that, that you're trying to look after. I says, you have chapters in your life, and it's our story that we write and we create. So regardless of where you are with your life, I was talking to a friend of mine, he's probably mid-50s, going through a divorce, and is going through a rough time. And I said to him, you're creating the next chapter of your life. And that last chapter is closed, and there might be some aspects of it, but it's our imagination that allows us to create, if we allow it to, and if we get out of our own way, so to speak,
Yes.
And I know a great tool that you've applied and I really value is a concept of, mirroring, and mirroring means different things to different people. And it's a technique that I learned really through kind of, obsessing a little bit with Buddhist teachings, which is stepping outside of myself to see myself. And I didn't share this with you, so I'll ask you two-pronged to maybe describe mirroring. But another piece that I've used is a lot of people talk about positive self-talk and affirmations. So I was having a conversation with my wife on a weekend hike, and he says, although we know the science of positive affirmations and self-talk, it's also sometimes can be negative if we are lying to who we really are. So along with affirmations, I like to really align with my values and say, I aim to be, or I value X. and then I allow that kind of that mirror technique to say, am I being that? So maybe you could share what mirroring means to you and to kind of define it for those that don't know. And I'd love to
Yeah.
hear your opinion on kind of, what I just
Oh, that's
described.
good. That's rich. I like that. I like that. So I first really understood mirroring when when I started to just explore. I've always been somebody that was quite reflective, meaning I see what's going on around me and I'm able to adjust. So this is like the cultural aspect of mirroring. Now, that can be a little dangerous. It's something we also call being a chameleon,
Hmm?
because it can be, if we don't know ourselves and we're not stable and secure in ourselves, we can end up just kind of reflecting back whatever is around us. But in the tool of self-awareness, when it comes to mirroring, it's beautiful to look at our triggers. So for me, whenever I started to hear this concept of mirroring, to look at where I have my own triggers, let's say I have a friend who says something and immediately I go like, she's so direct and so annoying. Like, that's so frustrating. This was one of mine, right? Because what I grew up with, and it's a bit back to that same story, there were a few women that I knew growing up when I was young who were kind of mentors. But I can remember a few of them were quite outspoken. And the response that they got back from the world was like, you need to calm down, you need to stop being so direct and so, aggressive. And so in my mind, what would happen was I would say, okay, that's not good, I don't want that. So that was the trigger that was instilled when I was young. So now whenever I would meet somebody, when I was discovering all of this, and I would say, she's so obnoxious, when I paused, what it was actually, when I looked at myself, right? When I stopped looking for the keys outside in the yard, but I actually turned back in, it was the fact that I was jealous. Because these were women that had no problem speaking their mind. Maybe they didn't do it as gracefully as I think that they should have. That's fine. But what it really was it was my own reflection thinking, gosh, I wish I could share so freely with what I truly am. And that ties into that whole point of the way that we talk to ourselves, because I had told myself, oh, those thoughts that you have about opinions and what you think of other people, that's not okay. So you need to push that down and come up with something polite to say. I grew up with the saying, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Well, there's something to that, but there's also something to vulnerability and being real. If I'm hurt and I don't share that with you, that's unfair to you. Because now I'm holding a judgment and a shadow within myself that I'm not revealing. And so it stunts my growth, and it also stunts the possibility for you to know that actually there's a boundary that's been crossed for me and I feel uncomfortable. And so in that way, I don't believe that it's just about, I always say this, not just slapping a smiley face on everything, right? Because that doesn't help anything. But what is helpful is to recognize that it's all stories.
Yeah.
And we're constantly telling ourselves stories. The thing is, sometimes we forget that we're the author of those stories as well.
Yes, and it's true, because what ends up happening is whatever you absorb, it stays with you. So I had similar things where you pick your battles, and if I didn't resonate with something, I was aware of, if a button gets pushed, it's my button, right? Because the one thing we control is our emotions and our reactions to things. But in a similar situation, I was absorbing something and I chose, I'm not going to speak up here because love and acceptance, and I didn't agree to the point that you just made, but I started to have resentment,
Yeah.
and because I started to carry those negative emotions with me, And then it's that inner journey of how do you communicate those messages? How do you portray it to not offend and so on and so forth? But we learn so much about ourselves by other people. And it's important. I think the number one thing here is to be open to understanding. There was a podcast I listened to with Aubrey Marcus,
Mm.
and he was speaking about the ability to love and accept yourself fully, but know that we can be better. And I think
Mm.
that's a kind of that challenge we
Oh, yeah.
have, yeah, of knowing I'm exactly who and where I'm supposed to be today, but I know I can be better. And it reminded me of a statement that Jordan Peterson, shared, which was only compare yourself to who you were yesterday.
Yes.
Right. So, and kind of that gets into how do we apply these techniques. But I think in any personal development, we have to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves why, and
Yes.
being open to it and accepting to it and loving to it. And then finding a
Absolutely.
way to share that boundary with love and gratitude. Right.
Yes.
And because that's how we learn. Right. So,
Yes, yes. This was one of my mentors growing up. She always used to say, it's about the balance of grace and truth,
oh, I love that.
right?
Yeah.
Because the truth without grace can be too harsh and can be damaging and hurtful, and too much grace without the truth leaves it shallow and removes the depth.
Yeah.
And but with those two together, it creates beautiful space for these things, and I love coming back to that point that you were talking about with Aubrey Marcus. It's something that I've heard the term future present,
Hmm.
right? Because I can remember people getting so confused, or I can remember being confused because I used to think about the present moment as like this hairline between all of the past and all that is to come. And it felt like walking a tightrope. Like, oh, I'm only in the present. I'm in the present. I'm listening to what Tole says. I'm only in the present. But the present is all there is. But embodied in the present is all that has happened. So all that has happened in the past is integrated in this moment. And it holds the full potential of the future. And so that's why, like the past, that's why we say don't dwell on the past, because the past is already here. It's embodied in the moment. So we don't have to think about it
Or relive it.
or relive it again and again and
Yes.
again. Yeah, yeah.
That's a different topic for a different day. Yeah, that's all of us, right? I think you and I shared this when we chatted the first time and getting to know each other a little bit more was, I've been taught that we choose the lessons that we want in this existence, and you'll face them until you master them. And once you master them, they come back to ensure that you master them. But they'll come back in different forms And there's a great story, not to get into a tangent, that Portia Lewis shares. So
Uh-huh.
Portia Lewis, and not to get into Wayne Dyer, but this morning I spent a lot of time listening to him, and he shared at a conference a story about Portia Lewis or Portia Nelson. I think it's Portia Lewis, and she went to a seminar, and they gave them 4 flashcards and said, "We want you to write the 4 chapters of your life." And he jokes and says it's a small index card, so they don't write a long chapter. And the first chapter is she walks out of her house. She walks down the street. There's a big hole in it. She falls in, but it's not her fault. It emphasizes not her fault. She struggles to get out, eventually does, and she continues down her path. And it's chapter 2 of her life. She walks down the same street. There's a hole in it. She falls in. It's not her fault, right? She struggles to get out, continues down her path. Chapter 3, she walks down the same street. There's a hole in it. It is her fault. She quickly, crawls out. Chapter 4, she walks down a new street. And it's such a great story, because how often do we make the same mistakes over and over again, whether it's choosing the wrong friends, choosing the wrong jobs and roles and wrong relationships. And we're like, I don't know why this happens to me. I always end up with the same person. I always end up in the same situation, because we're not learning from those lessons. And even once you learn them, they're going to come back in a different form, right?
Yes.
So when I was having this conversation with my wife recently, because she's having similar circumstances with whether it's clients or whether it's friends, and I remind her of the story. Says, until you master this lesson, whatever you're supposed to learn from it, it's not my journey to learn it, it's yours, right? it's going to come back in some form. It'll be a new relationship or a new job, but it's up to us to be observant and aware and say, hey, I'm ready to learn and accept this. So sorry
Yes.
for the tangent there.
No, but it's beautiful, right? Because this is also a bit of that perspective.
Yeah.
Because when you keep seeing that same thing coming and you have this attitude, damn it, like, I thought I was done with this. Or you have the mentality, I'm becoming a master at this.
Yeah, there we go.
And life is giving me the chance to master this
Yeah.
again and again and again. Obviously, I didn't learn my lesson fully the first time. Good. It's here again. Yay.
So last night I was talking to my son. My son is 18. He's graduating high school, without a graduation. We're not too happy about that, but, and he's preparing for college. He's finally at an age where he's listening to some of the things mom and dad have been trying to share. And he's bought The Secret. He's listening to Abraham and Esther Hicks. And so last night he's asking my wife and I around the dinner table, which is a rare feat in our household to get the three of us at dinner, and says, can you help me understand manifestation? He was listening to Alan Watts and says, what do you remember? And I says, well, I have lots of teachers, whether it's Alan Watts or Wayne Dyer, and depending on where I am, if they speak to you, then, I double down on themes is what I call them.
Yeah.
And I says, if he's not speaking to you, then, just put him to the side and come back to him when he does. He said, what do you remember? I says, about Alan Watts specifically. And I says, one thing I always stood out to me was a speech he gave where he says, the reason we don't have something is because we want it. And my son's starting to meditate, not daily, but starting to, but really he wants to manifest becoming a millionaire, right? So I said to him, my focus is you can have goals, a tangible goal, if it's a monetary dollar amount, and strive for it, but that's not really manifestation and visualization. For me personally, I'm not an expert by any means. So I say, for me, I try to say focus on a space, not a place. And he says, well, what does that mean? I says, for me, it's, if I want to strive for a level of abundance to where my grandchildren great-grandchildren will never have to worry about wealth, and I could serve humanity and my legacies in a nature without struggle. I'm not putting a dollar amount on it. I'm not putting a big house and a car on it. Somebody might say there's still some attachment to the things that I'm asking for, but I can up-level that. And I said, it's a space. And he says, okay, I'm having trouble with that. I says, well, don't worry, take your time, but maybe you can help me, define it better and help the audience here. What does manifestation mean to you? And how do we apply it to our lives in a kind of a practical way?
I can't remember who it was right now, but there was once I heard the definition of somebody who was quite a skeptic talking about manifestation. And he said, you can believe whatever you want, but when was the last time that you were around two people, one hated the world and felt like, everything was always going wrong, and the other was always like excited and seeing opportunities everywhere? Which one of those do you want to be around? And
Oh,
everybody
wow.
was like, obviously the one that, is creative and sees potential. He said, if you're that one, people will be more drawn to help you always. And so from a specific interaction standpoint, it's the exact same, not just human to human, but life to itself. Anything that we push away, it causes resistance and strain, right? And we absorb that tension.
And call it back to us, in
And
fact.
we
Yeah.
call it back to
Yeah.
us. When we surrender, it's a totally different thing, because surrender, I heard this the other day and it was so beautiful. Surrender is not an action. Surrender is a knowingness and an awareness.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
And I was like, oh, because sometimes I sit there, okay, I need to surrender. How do I surrender?
You're holding on to it too tight. Yeah.
I'm holding on to the idea that I need to surrender. And once we let go, again, whether it's letting go of the stories that we've told, the labels of who we are or who we need to be, we are, regardless of the labels. I can remember when I transitioned from being an actual designer, like doing workplace strategy and architectural interiors, to doing coaching. I loved the coaching and I loved that part, but I had a crisis because I was the creative one, right? At a party, I was creative.
Yeah.
And when I introduced myself, people were like, "Oh my gosh, she's an interior architect. That's so cool." I had to realize that I am still all the things that made me who I was before without the label. And the label was what I was holding on to instead of holding on to myself. Instead of holding on to the trust that I am this paradox, that I am, as I think it was Tolle who said, the universe embodied in human form for a period of time. And I'm also the most insignificant grain of dust in this vast universe who will live and die and fine. And when I can hold the paradox of being both of those, it allows me to unleash and to open up to not only giving my gifts, but also receiving all that life has to give me, while at the same time holding that humility of I didn't do anything other than exist.
Mhm.
And just because I'm willing to exist and be engaged and involved with life, that's it.
It reminds me of a great statement. That's beautiful, Rebecca. I'm getting goosebumps as you're saying that. Is we are not humans having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a short human experience. You know, and I've heard that before, and it speaks true. When we surrender and we shed all of these things, and it's one of the reasons why I was encouraged to be more public with these conversations, because I felt like it was a gap. And I've been so fortunate that a lot of my personal development, yes, did start with Tony Robbins, like most of us, and so on and so forth. But it really was inward work first, and one of the things that we shared in common was that, our excitement about a conversation that Tim Ferriss had with Brene Brown.
Yes.
And I really love both of them, and
Thank you.
separately. And when I saw them coming together for a podcast, Brene Brown came on Tim Ferriss's podcast pre-pandemic, so they were in person together. And about an hour into their conversation, they both came to an agreement. And if you haven't heard it, I can share a link to it. It's a great conversation, which talks a lot about relationships and her journey and his journey. But a period that really stuck out to me was where they focused on the real goal for today is inward work, right?
Mm.
And both of them are making a huge focus. Of course, Brene Brown is a thought leader in vulnerability. And Tim Ferriss has brought in all sorts of people onto his show, like Gabor Mate focusing on childhood trauma, and Brene Brown on vulnerability, and so on and so forth. So I applaud him for using his platform to have these great conversations with thought leaders outside of the normal business and millionaire mindset type folks. And nothing wrong with them either, right?
Sure.
But it really touched on, inward work is so important. And there's a reason why peak performers focus on mindset. Currently, we're all watching kind of The Last Dance on the Bulls era, here in the States. And Phil Jackson was a Zen teacher who passed his lessons on to the Bulls and to the Lakers. And you'll hear Michael and Kobe Bryant talk about how important this work is to obtain a flow state and peak performance. So I know you talk a lot about this with your clients, as far as how this aspect of mindfulness and meditation and vulnerability aligns greatly with mindset practices and innovation. So when we talk about, today, in today's world, innovation and automation are going to increase as human to human interaction minimizes. So what does that mean to you? What does, this bridge of these personal inward traits align with innovation mean to you? And what do you share with your clients?
Ah. So anytime the word innovation is mentioned, because all the companies that I work with, this is always one of the big keys. How do we innovate? And innovation is creativity in action. right? So it's the physical manifestation and the form of the creative spirit, because creativity is the exploration, right? The exploration, but it's not the actual action. But to create space for creativity, we have to have safety, trust, and curiosity. And there are other factors that play into that, but like each of those begins first with us. Now, it's not to say that our external environment is not critical to those things, but our external circumstances cannot create trust within ourselves. They cannot instill or reawaken curiosity. They can only create space for it, which is, I love that you said that before, create the space, not the situation or not the
Mm.
specifics. And that comes from reconnecting with this childlike wonder,
Mm.
right? And this is what vulnerability is. Children have to be vulnerable because they haven't yet learned, yeah, I need to be careful what I say, because maybe, if I ask her to play and she doesn't want to play with me, I'm going to feel horrible. No, they walk straight up and they have this innate boldness of approaching life because they haven't yet realized that they're separate from life in their heads, because they're not. They're fully engaged. But we, over time, we kind of, and it's an important process, right? I will say it's very important and it's critical. It's just then the reintegration, because we need to separate from our parents and feel the independence and all of these different things. They're vital, and it's an innocent, although can sometimes be traumatic, part of growing up. But then this is the coming full circle. And this is remembering the vulnerability and the wonder and the trust that comes from, I'm being held by life, not by my partner, not by my church, not by my spiritual community, not by my boss. I'm being held by life first. And from that perspective, then I can interact with the world around me. And that means that sometimes, yes, it might be tough. And that's the vulnerability and the shame. And this is one of these things about the full spectrum living. Full spectrum.
Well, it reminds me of a Stoic statement, the obstacle is the way, where we really have to do what is, what is unnatural. I share this story with my wife once, which is, she loves her little nephew who's about 5 now. And I says, if you look at, your nephew, and I think I share this story every time I have the unique story. I think it's the most poignant thing in the world, right? And maybe she doesn't. And we were driving, he must have been 4 at the time. I says, I want you to imagine, your nephew with his, his rain boots on, stomping in a puddle, slapping his hands just in utter joy, right? I said, what does that look like to you? And we all get a smile when you think of a young child doing that. And I said, I want you to picture that we're in a bar in Ireland, and there's just somebody just had one too many, just singing to a song, having a beer to himself on the corner of the bar, just by himself, dropping beer all over himself. How do you view this person? And we're going to naturally, as he says, through that journey, probably make a judgment. Look at that drunk, But in a conscious universal energy, there is no difference and no separation between the young nephew stomping in the puddle and the individual at the bar having a good time. And when we create these judgments, we're impacting the ability to be innovative, to be mindful, and to be conscious and things like that, So I know we're running up on time. Rebecca, one thing I always like to ask, anybody that comes on the show is, what's 1 or 2 pieces of advice in this inner architectural journey, that individuals that you work with, that you would give either your younger self or to a new client, is kind of a tactical practice that they can apply on this journey of asking those whys of their beliefs and how they can really impact change in their lives. What would you share?
I would share trust through conscious rebellion, meaning don't be afraid to ask the questions, why and why not, but pay attention that you're asking them to yourself and your own belief systems. And don't be afraid to ask the questions, because yeah, it's scary sometimes, but this is what builds trust. Like, I think about myself. If I had trusted myself more when I was younger. I had this vision of that trust was something that like some people just had. They knew the answer, and I just didn't. I saw way too many possibilities and there were too many options and I didn't know. How could they be so certain? And then I realized nobody knows. There is no right way or singular way. Every way has consequences. Some are consequences we really want, and others are consequences we might not like so much. But to trust and to allow myself to move more, to play with it, and to ask those questions when something inside goes, like that's now I had turned the volume down on this so much, but my internal red flag is this little sound, because it means something that's being said doesn't align with what I'm picking up energetically or body language or whatever. Something is out of alignment. And so to ask the questions, to rebel intentionally inside of our own minds, and to really have that, I love it, desire and intense search for truth, but start first with ourselves. It's much easier, the things that we see in the outside world, but it's much more valuable to do that exploration first within.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great. I know we didn't touch on it today, but I loved the story you shared on kind of the it's a Lao Tzu statement that I love, which is the journey of 10,000 miles. I think he says a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and you talk about just taking one step at a time, working towards that goal, not getting in our own way.
Yes.
Where can people find you? Where's the best place for people to absorb some of your messages, some of your content? Where can people look out for you?
Sure. So probably the easiest way, because it has links out to everything, would be the website, which
Okay.
is rebeccaroberts.com.
Okay.
But yeah, because my way of expression is through video. So I
And you're great
tend
at it.
but I tend to, that ends up being like my way of exploring the things that I'm
Yeah.
dealing with, also that my clients are dealing with. So exploring what are the hot topics that are around right now, and you can find those on the website and different explorations. So yeah, that's the best way.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I am really excited to have you on and have this conversation. I could talk to you for
So
hours. For those that are not following Rebecca, please go to rebeccaroberts.com. You can find her on all of her platforms, and please like, comment, and share. And thank you again for joining.
thank you so much, Ali. This was perfect. Super nice.
Thank you as well.